I happen to be interested in poetry and modern poems. And so when I saw this volume, obviously the title attracted me, Judas. Now it's usual for poets to write, say, 1 or 2 poems about Judas, but you've written a whole volume on Judas. What attracted you?
It's not the most commercial of subjects, is it? So I probably need to address that for the next one. The previous volume was about the witch hunts in 1640 Suffolk, so I need a quick talking to by my publisher, I think. That's a core question, isn't it? I've always found Judas to be somebody you can't pigeonhole, although he has been pigeonholed. He's been easily or too easily demonizable, but I find him to be a curiously and resonantly plural figure. Talk about a man caught in a cleft stick, the guy with a dark halo, you know, the demon who betrayed Christ and yet the necessary agent of salvation. And so in choosing to write more than a couple of poems about him, I wanted to explore that paradox. So he's a real crux, really, and I wanted to blow apart some of the problems of Judas.
There are only about 22 references to Judas in the New Testament. Everybody actually probably, if you say to somebody, you're a Judas, it's not exactly a compliment, because of course everybody knows that he betrayed Jesus with a kiss for money. Those are the 3 things I think that emerge from all the gospel writers. St. John, of course, adds to that by saying that actually he was a thief and that's why he did it. He was grasping, you know. Out of all of that, you've written lots of wonderful poems about Judas, which speculates in all kinds of ways about the kind of person he was. Would you like to kind of explore that a bit?
It's all about the gaps, isn't it? And that lack of a full biography of him is precisely, that is the gift for a creative writer. So it's filling in those manifest gaps. One wants to know how he spends his time, what he sounds like when he talks, how he feels about a particular episode in the Gospels that is familiar to us, but his response to it is not. And there's that wonderful moment at the Last Supper, isn't there, where Christ turns to Jesus and says, what you're about to do it quickly.
That's right.
He knows what he's about to do, or does he? You know, what you're about to do, I know you're about to do something,
yes,
and I know it's probably not a good thing,
yes,
just do it quickly.
And that's the dilemma in the gospel, isn't it? That Judas is about to betray him. Does Jesus really know? And is Judas, as it were, a necessary tool in order for Jesus to die, as it were,
yes,
in order that his work might be fulfilled?
And that injunction, what you're about to do it quickly, seems to imply that, doesn't it? That you're a necessary part of what I'm about to go through, which is such a paradox and such an affecting moment and such a moment of terror, really, for both parties.
That's right.
For both parties. Because surely Judas at that moment knows what Jesus is feeling.
And of course, one therefore feels a bit sorry for Judas in that sense. One has enormous sympathy for him. At least I do. When I think about him and the loneliness of that position, and perhaps doing it out of love in order to force Jesus in a particular direction. He hopes that Jesus will lead a rebellion against Rome, and he's just pushing him just to see whether he will. And of course, he dies disappointed. There's a wonderful a poem, Corpus, the trail of blood from here to where the last gob hit the ground. The morning had an air of perfect commonplace. I howled so silently, I know he heard. That inner kind of torment of Judas, knowing that Jesus knows his inner anguish.
That's right. And what you were saying earlier about love, again, that centrality of that kiss, it's too easily dismissed as a parody of an act of love. I think love is central to Judas. I think love is central to his tragedy, and one doesn't have to psychologize in a sophistical way in order to say that here is a man who was deeply distressed, deeply disappointed. There's enough, I think, evidence there, without overfilling the gaps, as it were, too speculatively.
Well, you don't want to hang yourself if you're not distressed.
So there's grief. Grief and love, I think, are the ways into Judas more than cynicism, demonization, and that arch betrayal that seems to have crystallized around him. What do we mean when we call somebody a Judas nowadays? You know, I mean, It's an act of sympathy in many ways. You've been put into a certain position.
Yes, you're letting people down. Somehow you've betrayed, you've abandoned your principles. It's all that kind of stuff, I suppose.
And you know it.
Yes.
There's a wonderful 1990s publication by Brendan Kennelly called The Book of Judas, and one thing, again, I raised it to the status of an epigraph here because it seems to govern a lot of how I approach Judas. Brendan Kennelly says of Judas, he is just another ordinary, appalled man. And that idea of the commonplace. Here's a man caught in a historical bind, doesn't want to be there. How do you deal with that? Just another ordinary, appalled man. And I think that human tragedy, we tend to regard him as almost the superhero of betrayals. No, he's not that. It's just a man, as Christ was. In many ways, whatever the nuances of one's belief, an ordinary, frightened man, as he certainly was in the Gethsemane moment.
Yes, that's right.
Here's a poem called Like, where some of the cynicism of Judas comes through, but some of that deep insecurity also, I hope, comes through. Branched sage was blooming yellow on the wayside, and here's me telling him, spare me the eternal similes, like seed, like nets, like this man, like another, like a child. This is worse than dark. Tell it like it is. He stopped, that maddening smile again. He said, the kingdom is, and tapped a finger on my chest. The scent of sage was like a song. And what I was trying to get at there was, Christ's similes in his parables, and Judas saying, I don't want that kind of discourse. I don't want something to be like something. I want it to be something. I want it to be reality, or at least a metaphor, not a simile. But then he ends off talking in the same way. Tell it like it is. And the whole thing ending with that spiritual scent rather than a kind of dogmatic answer or even with a word. It's that ambiguity I was trying to catch. And Judas in this volume inhabits those gaps and inhabits those clefts and those dark spaces. He's constantly in Jerusalem's alleyways. That's his proper territory, I think, not out in the light of day.
Jeffrey Archer once, giving advice to somebody else who was writing on Judas, said, I've written a novel on Judas. He said, it's the only book that hasn't been a commercial success. Avoid the subject. But you just said there, where do you stand personally on Judas? Because there are two sides. He's seen by most people just as somebody who betrayed Jesus, and yet the Gospels kind of hint, as you say, that without him, then Christ's work would not have happened. God is on his side, to quote Bob Dylan.
That's right. Yes, if indeed, of course, he existed at all, and the historical orthodoxy, and this is not a book that's interested in orthodoxy in that sense, it's interested in blowing that orthodoxy apart and being, if not iconoclastic, then certainly speculative. The orthodoxy is that he didn't exist at all, that he was the necessary invention of a young faith that wanted to put clear blue water between itself and its Jewish roots. So there's a lot of theological politics, the politics of theology, about the construction of Judas. And of course, that's been endlessly developed and ramified over the last 2,000 years. Yeah. So where do I stand? I was approaching him as a creative writer, rather than as a dogmatic theologian or a dogmatic historian. So what I would say, I guess, is that my Judas can't be pinned down, and I didn't want to pin him down. So the reader at the end of the volume won't, I hope, be able to be dogmatic about Judas. Now, maybe some people will feel perhaps let down by that in the sense that no secrets are being divulged, there's no grand narrative, there's no key being offered here. It's all about the ambiguity, precisely because I think that's the idea we're inheriting.
That's the nature of poetry, I suppose, isn't it, really? I mean, you've written about R.S. Thomas. He was the same. People said, well, did he believe in God or did he not? I mean, he wrote poetry that seemed to point in different directions depending on where he was coming from on a particular day, because he wasn't a systematic theologian.
That's right. There's no system there, and that's precisely what he's working against. And I think there's a lot of R.S. in this in many ways. And I mean, I'm taking fire and a great admirer, and lucky enough to be Thomas's friend towards the end of his life, which I'm very grateful for, and grateful for as a creative writer as well, because there's a lot of the pared down quality of Judas speak, as it were, here.
There is.
That takes fire from
yes,
Thomas.
there is. It reminded me very much of some of Father Thomas's poetry.
Good.
That obviously it had a great influence on your style of writing.
That's
really.
right, it did.
Yeah, that's right. Well, he's not the most appealing character, of course, in the New Testament, if, as you say, he existed at all. And some Christians, of course, would be horrified to hear you and I say that. And it's a fairly bleak picture in places that you paint. Is that your perception of the world in which we live?
I think that's more my perception of that cleft stick that I think Judas, had he existed, would have found himself in, because I think we do have to think ourselves back into the socio-political reality that Judas would have been inside, as it were. Here was a man craving a release from Roman occupation, craving a certain kind of deliverance, but not knowing quite what that was. Jewish apocalyptic thought, Jewish political thought, all is bound up with our conception of Judas, even though, of course, we're inheriting a Judas that, as we said, might be simplistically constructed by us. But he's coming out of that problem, that social and political problem, really, as well. So it was a very bleak social reality and political reality. But I think I'm more interested, although I'm historicizing Judas to a large extent, in psychologizing him.
Yes.
And my Judas, I guess, and that's a phrase, isn't it, my Judas, is a flawed character in many ways. He can't see, he's a cynic. He's not allowing himself to break through to a position of happiness or joy. Joy haunts this Judas. He wants to be joyful. He wants to connect with Jesus, who may or may not for him at different stages in the volume be Christ, but can't allow himself to. But he recognizes that. He's an astute, I think, analyzer of his own flaws. And again, that's another duality that I wanted to emerge.
And there are almost hints in the poetry, or bits of it, that there's almost a kind of love-hate relationship going on with Jesus, in places almost homoerotic.
It is, and that eroticism is certainly something that we've inherited from 2,000 years of constructions of him. One of my favourite rock bands, although they haven't been producing great stuff recently, U2, back in the early 90s, they've got a very, very insightful, I think very intelligent song about Judas. And the lyrics, if I remember them, run something like, it's Judas speaking, as Judas speaks in this volume. In the garden, I was playing the tart. I kissed your lips and broke your heart. So that kind of relationship is always something. I mean, it's the kiss is central, isn't it? Here?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
It's the way in which Judas identified Christ in the darkness of that garden with the torches all around. But it's a funny act. I mean, again, it's that paradoxical act of love as hate, as you said. So one takes fire from those small details in the Gospels that are not expanded on, and that's the business of poetry.
Yes, and sometimes he almost implies that Jesus was a fraudster. Meek shall inherit the earth. Really?
Tell me how.
Yeah.
I mean, exactly. This is a Judas who's a cynic, as I said. He's also jealous. The word charisma is something that one can readily associate with the historical Jesus. In that word charismatic in a more theological sense. And so my Jesus is certainly jealous of Jesus' ability to communicate. He's an arch communicator. And that comes through here. So on that very human level, he wants to be Jesus. He wants to have that control over people. He wants to be able to reach and connect with people, and he can't. And there's something in him that can't communicate. Although, of course, if he's writing poetry, as it were, if he's speaking in poetry, 6 stanzas of 3 lines each, he's an arch communicator, I hope, if the poetry works.
Yes.
So again, that's another paradox.
Yeah.
I mean, he is a guy who can't articulate himself, but again is speaking in poetry. So those inward paradoxes of the volume, I hope things that the reader will pick up on.
You say you're interested in psychology of Judas, but inevitably there are deep theological questions in this poetry. I mean, can I ask you, are you religious yourself, and are you exploring kind of questions of faith yourself here?
I think that's an entirely fair question, and it's a question that will come out of a volume entitled Judas, which is about Judas. And Jesus, of course, comes in and out of the frame.
Yes, he does,
here.
quite a lot.
and in certain poems he's represented in this particular way. In the next poem, of course, he's represented in a completely different way or in an ambiguous way. So I guess that ambiguity that's at the heart of the volume is probably, I'd say, to be truthful, at the heart of my own faith. I mean, my own personal history is that I was brought up as a nonconformist, an independent congregationalist, changed to the church, baptised into the church in Wales in my early 20s. And I would probably say that my reading of history and of politics of first century Palestine, also my reading of creative writing, poetry such as R.S. Thomas's, has had an effect in inflecting my faith. I'm probably closer now, not to say that it will change, to a late R.S. Thomas view that God is precisely that which we can't know. And I think, you know, it's interesting for me to be able to talk about this because writing this volume, I think, has had an effect on swerving perhaps my idea of God as a personal God, and more towards that unknowability, or rather the plurality of constructions that we constantly have to go through. I would still regard myself as having a faith, but it's in the process of not definition or ossifying or crystallizing, but of being understood by me, I think.
But that's perfectly orthodox, isn't it? Because, you know, none of us can know God. The unknowability of God runs through Holy Scripture. It runs through the mystics. It's, you know, it's not just R.S. Thomas, is it? So it's perfectly okay in a sense.
It is an orthodox position that there are multiple positions on that unknowability, of course, which one might say is post or post-Christian, or, you know, whatever technical expensive term one might put. But I think writing this volume was part of a self-exploration, which is, I guess, the question you're asking.
To come back to R.S. Thomas, I mean, sometimes he said a poem just came, and then sometimes he wrestled with it for days and sort of, I remember him telling me once that, you know, there were lots of paper wrinkled up and thrown into the waste paper bin. How do you write poetry? Does it come easily?
I think it tends to come, thank goodness, it tends to come relatively easily. I mean, it's not the day job in that sense. You know, the academic job is the day job, although, thank goodness, you know, the poetry is now very much part of research, as it absolutely should be, because there's a big research base for poetry. I mean, poetry is not something that's plucked from the air. It's got an underpinning. So that's good, and I think that's been a sea change in the academy, really. Whether it comes easily to me, yeah, I think it does. What I've chosen for a volume like Judas, of course, is a model, because I've got the Gospels as a certain kind of model I can write back against, I can intervene, I can choose an angle of entry onto something that's already there. So that always helps. And you were asking earlier about why I'm writing a full volume on Judas rather than individual poems. Well, it's tracking, if you like, the Judas story and the Jesus story. So I've got that narrative to write against. And that always helps to kickstart a poem, because you know that, you know, the next stage in the gospel is this, so I start thinking about that. But of course, the challenge there is not to write squarely to that model, but rather to try and inflect it. So it's always a creative act, not a parody or a plagiarism.
And it's got to be a creative act, hasn't it? Because I think there are only about 22 references to Judas in the whole of the New Testament.
That's right, yeah.
Although he's had a profound effect on Christian history. I mean, some people say that it's the character of Judas that has resulted in anti-Semitism.
Yes, and there are spikes of anti-Semitism and spikes of references to Judas throughout history, from the medieval period to you know, the Nazi era and contemporary eras. And Judas always seems to be invoked at those points. So he's still very much a resonant and relevant figure for perhaps all the wrong reasons. And this tries to inflect that. I mean, it's too much to say that this, in a sense, tries to offer a way through theologically. Certainly, it would be absurd to say that it tries to offer a way through politically. But my Judas, of course, and again, I hope that readers will recognize this, he wanders through first century Jerusalem in a weird kind of historical stereo where what we've made of him and his afterlife is as real to him as is the Arab-Israeli conflict, as the tension between Jews and Romans. So that strange dual universe that he inhabits. I wanted to bring those anachronisms through to make him relevant. So he'll see two women air kissing in the lobby of the Sheraton. He'll see Israeli guards, Israeli teenagers, as I saw them when I went to Jerusalem recently for research for this book, holding their automatic weapons. And he'll respond to those things. As I think historical figures need to be reanimated by poets and brought into a relevant space.
Are you interested in any other biblical characters? Are we going to see more books on biblical characters? Or?
Yes, so the next one is Son of Judas. No, I am fascinated by it. And it seems to be something that's in the air at the moment. I mean, you've got Colm Toibin and many others writing about biblical characters, about Mary, so it was a great book. A new biography of Judas, Peter Stanford, has just appeared. So I mean, there's a perennial interest there. For me, not to say that it's going to be the next volume, but I'm always been fascinated by Lazarus. I mean, isn't he the man? He's the man who needs to talk a little bit more. He's the man who didn't talk, obviously. Or the daughter of Jairus, for example. You know, those who did, in the gospel narrative, in the Christian story, die and come back. I mean, those are the voices that I think the poet should be animating and making speak out. And of course, there's a Lazarus poem here, where Judas narrates the miracle, ? Of Lazarus, and he makes the point that he's not ringside, so he doesn't know what happens, you know. And Christ goes into the darkness of the tomb, and it's all about not knowing what happens in the darkness of the tomb.
Of course, there's even less about Lazarus in the New Testament than there is about Judas.
Indeed, and it's the shortest verse anyway, isn't it? Jesus wept. So, but that idea, which you touched on quite rightly earlier, about the paucity of references to both Judas and people like Lazarus, and their resonance has been out of all proportion to their reference, haven't they? But it's the gaps in the Gospels, it's the absences, the silences, that which is not said, that are fascinating for imaginative writers.
And the same is true about Jesus, actually.
Indeed, yeah.
Because, you know, when you think about it, we've only got 4 short Gospels. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know what his height was.
Exactly.
Or anything.
And as with Judas, of course, you get contradictory references, both to Jesus and to Judas, especially on the subject of something as major as how he died.
Yes.
And of course, in this volume, he doesn't die. He goes on talking, as it were. So that's one major departure from that model of the New Testament.
Yeah. Yes, because Matthew has him hanging himself, and then in the Book of Acts, of course, he goes out and his bowels gush out. I think
it's strange, isn't it? In the sea of, in the field of blood, the Al-Sadama.
Yeah, that's right.
And I remember tracking a number of references to Judas across 2,000 years of responses to him. And there's a wonderful one here, which I chose as an epigraph from one of my favourite romantic period authors, Thomas de Quincey, 1857, an essay on Judas Iscariot. And de Quincey says, in saying that the viscera, the insides of Iscariot, had burst and gushed out, the original reporter meant simply that his heart had broken.
Yes, I thought that was very moving.
Yeah, no, it's a psychologization, a humanization of that sensationalist account of his death. You know, that there's something here about the death of Christ that broke Judas's heart.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yes. Apparently, I haven't been there, but there is a convent on the site where Judas is alleged to have hanged himself. Right. Have you been to that convent?
I didn't go to that convent. I mean, I went to Gethsemane, and this was in 2009, as I said, research for this book. And it was a strange experience, trying to map this book onto the cartography, if you like, of biblical Jerusalem. And what's amazing is that, I don't know whether you agree, but my sense that the biblical Jerusalem is so tiny.
Yes, it is.
It's small. You know, one can walk from the Garden of Gethsemane to Golgotha in 20 minutes. Yeah. It takes a good deal longer if you're carrying a cross. So it was a very emotional, very uncanny feeling going to Jerusalem, because Christians all know, have internalized the geography of Jerusalem, but when you're there, of course, there's this reality that doesn't seem real to you anymore, because it doesn't fit with your preconception. And I remember phoning my grandmother, actually, who was 94 at the time, from the Garden of Gethsemane, and she couldn't quite believe that her grandson was there. You know, the idea that one could actually stand in the Garden of Gethsemane. And while I was there, I was trying to compose myself and say, is this the place of the arch betrayal? trying to think perhaps not, trying to think into a space beyond orthodoxy. It's difficult.
Well, Peter Stanford apparently went to this convent, and he said that there were no traces of Judas or any reference to Judas there, almost as if the nuns were embarrassed that he even existed, really. So we come back full circle in a sense. Did he or did he not exist?
Indeed, and that kind of elision, or that wiping out of Judas's trace is very interesting.
Yeah.
Of course, he's venerated as a saint in some parts of the world, and in the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, he is the only disciple who finally and fully understands Christ's message. Yeah. He is Christ's particular friend, as it were, the only one who knows Christ's
Except
mission.
in the Gospel, you have the recurring phrase, better for that man had he not been born.
Yes, yeah. Again, I mean, absolutely paradoxical, but coming out of a variety of what we now know as belief communities, of course, in the early period of Christian diffusion, where the original knowledge is becoming memory, becoming interpretation more and more, and different belief communities believing different things, inflecting. I mean, authentic belief is too simple a term, isn't it? Yeah. And then that crystallizing into gospel truth. Yeah.
You've said all that, but the cover is very striking. It's almost, I mean, red being the colour of wickedness traditionally associated with Judas.
Indeed. Red hair, yes.
Yes, quite. Yeah. And here he is, almost a kind of sheep in wolf's clothing. There's a paradox there too.
Yes, here's the wolf howling. This is a wonderful representation made for the book, and I'm very grateful to him by one of Wales's best artists, Clive Hicks-Jenkins. And I think Clive was talking to me about this particular representation, and what he said he picked up from the volume is that sense of Judas's howl at the moment of crucifixion. And I think Clive is tapping into something that I did want to suggest, but also draw back from in the very next poem, which is that real connection between Judas and Jesus, which is in a sense erotic, which has to do with jealousy, that other big J, which is haunting the volume. But it needs to change. I didn't want dogma to take hold for more than a couple of poems. I wanted to kick the reader out of that and put him or her into a rather more difficult space, a space of change, so that at the end, as I said, of the book, one doesn't know who Judas is, because Judas doesn't know who Judas is. This is a biography, if you like, through the mouth of Judas himself, who's trying to understand what the heck happened in the last year, and especially in the last couple of days.
And is that what you'd like to leave your readers with?
I think that's a good question. I think it's a central question. It's a question that the readers will ask themselves. There's a sense in which there is no end to the volume. No ends are tied up, and it ends with Judas addressing the reader really and saying that I am the dark conductor of your lightning strikes. I am whatever you want me to be, but at least for the compass of 60 pages here, I get to speak. You make of me what you will. And I guess Judas is speaking to us, maybe through a howl. Maybe his most articulate sound is a howl, really. And again, that's a paradox, isn't it? Because a howl isn't nuanced speech, but it is Judas talk in many ways.
I remember going to the Orthodox Cathedral in Aswan and looking up at the ceiling and seeing Jesus and 11 disciples around the table for the Last Supper, and thinking, but there were 12, saying to the guide, well, where's Judas? And he said, Pope Shenouda, he says, no Judas. And there was no Judas around the table.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea, an interesting phrase, isn't it? No Judas.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I wonder if I could ask you a question and say, what did you make of the volume theologically, as it were? What do you think that, I mean, there are only individual believers, aren't there? Although there is such a thing, I guess, as orthodoxy. But is it a volume that you think will be regarded by some people as going beyond speculation towards iconoclasm?
I'm sure that some people will be shocked by it and will think, gosh, does he know what he's talking about here? Has he not read the Bible? For others of us, it's exploring very interesting questions. This theological conundrum at the heart of Judas's character, in a sense, that he betrays Jesus and yet he's the necessary tool for the salvation of the world in Christian parlance, as it were. And also, too, you feel the inner agony of Judas in this volume, I think. This kind of, theologians have written in the past and said, well, the thing about Judas was that he was trying to push Jesus in a particular direction against Rome. And Jesus wasn't doing it. And so he hopes that by pushing him in that direction, it'll happen. Yeah. And then he lives to regret it when, of course, it all goes wrong.
That's right. It's an interesting interpretation, that, and a very powerfully persuasive one in many ways, that for Judas, Jesus is a great disappointment. And that's something that skews our perspectives, isn't it? That he was looking for a martial Messiah. He was looking for the Big Bang and didn't get it. But continued to believe that Jesus could offer that if only Jesus could man up, as it were, and was, as you said, trying to force his hand. I mean, that's a received interpretation.
Yes, it is.
Of what is a great absence in many ways. Because there's no historical evidence for Judas, as there is certainly for Jesus, as there's certainly for St. Peter, and recently for Pontius Pilate. So that, again, that absence is something to play with.
And it's interesting because all the other disciples came from Galilee, country boys, if you like. Iscariot is a small town outside Jerusalem, so he was a city boy. Is that a kind of country city kind of contretemps as well?
That's interesting. And when Judas moves out of Jerusalem, around about halfway through this volume, and goes back to those months spent in Galilee, it's clear that he's never at home there, and that the fishermen disciples, there's a distance between them. He shakes their hands and looks at his hands and finds scale-spangled skin. So there's an otherness about Judas, and for him there's an otherness about him. It's not part of a community, so it's not a coherent group of disciples. He's always on the edge and edgy. And his view, of course, in this volume, and I wanted this to be true of Jesus as well, Jesus haunts Judas in this volume. Jesus happens for Judas always at the edges of the eye. So there's a sense in which Judas feels profoundly unsettled by Christ, stroke Jesus. I mean, he doesn't know which one he is. But there's a spatial haunting. Judas looks around, he's constantly looking around himself, looking over his shoulder, and suddenly Jesus is there. So Jesus is playing with Judas as well.
And it poses the question for me anyway. It's not just about Judas, it's about Jesus. Who is Jesus Christ for us today, as one theological volume puts it. It's asking that question too, it seems to me.
It is. And I wanted to capture that in one particular poem here, where, and quoting the Bible, of course, and quoting the Bible, there's a responsibility, I think, in quoting gospel, and I think one needs to be careful of that. I'm not one who believes that one can play fast and loose, and recent history has shown the dangers of that, obviously, and tragically. But there's one poem here where Christ asks him, "Who do you think I am?" which he does in the Gospels. Immediately Judas fires one back, "Who do you say you are?" But immediately what comes out of that is a question of who the heck am I? So there's that self-laceration in Judas, which must have been part of that. There's a wonderful phrase by one of Aris Thomas's favourites, as you know, of theologians, Kierkegaard, where Kierkegaard says, "What was it like for the disciples? How terrifying must it have been for the disciples to sit down every day and have lunch with God?" And that terror is there for Judas throughout. Even at those moments where he doesn't believe that Jesus is Christ, as it were, there's that haunting sense that he might be. What must it have been like, therefore, to walk with that guy in Galilee? Must have been absolutely terrifying.
The volume seems to imply that Judas is deeply theological in a sense, because he's asking all these questions, all the questions that ordinary people ask about the person of Jesus.
That's right. Yeah. And all the questions, you're right, and I'm glad you picked up on that because he knows 2,000 years of Christian theology in that time slip that I've put together here, he also asks the questions that the other disciples are not asking. Yeah. So, in a group, he'll be looking around and saying, why are you not asking this question? This is the central question. Ask him. And again, he's fascinated by Jesus as a performer, or as in places
Fraudster.
fraudster, or as a mere performer, as a man who multiplies words rather than actions. And again, that's tapping into what you were saying earlier, that interpretation of him as somebody who was deeply disappointed with the lack of apocalyptic action on the part of Jesus. Because he was looking for a different kind of
Yes,
saviour.
that's right. Have you ever thought of writing a volume of poetry on Jesus?
I have, yes. I mean, in a sense, this began as that, and then turned more towards Judas.
Right.
So I hope the haunting presence of Jesus comes through here. But it's something I think that I would very much consider writing about, dedicating another volume to.
I look forward to that very much.
Okay, you'll be the first to read it.
And perhaps we can have another conversation.
Let's see where we stand at that point. Yeah.
Damien, thank you very much indeed. I hope that people get as much enjoyment from this volume as I've had.
Diolch yn fawr, Mari. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr.
Croeso, diolch.